for me. Holding nothing back, you are broken. All heaven is
Thank you, Mike.
open.
And it's great to be able to share with you all this morning. And just wanted to start by saying thank you so much to all of you who prayed for us and supported us around the time of Amariah's birth. It was a really difficult time for us as a family, but we really felt the care and love of God through his people, through you as a church, in a special way at that time. So thank you so much. And I just want to appreciate David for giving me the opportunity to share this morning. And when he asked me what topic I'd like to speak on or what I'd like to share about, I said, actually, could I take one of the weeks from this series on Hebrews 11, this series which is all about faith, because I really believe these are times that call for the people of God to rise up in great faith. That actually these are days where we need to walk in great faith. And I want to be that kind of person, that person of faith. And as we look at these heroes in Hebrews 11, we see those examples of people who walked before God, and we remember them not because they were especially gifted or especially popular or even especially successful, but because of their great faith in God. And I know on that day when I see Jesus face to face, I hope that I'm going to hear those words, "Well done, good and faithful servant." And really that's my prayer for all of us today, that we would grow as people of faith as we keep following God. And as David said, we're going to be reading a little bit more about the early life of Moses and that of his parents this morning. So if you have a Bible, you can turn to Hebrews 11, and we're going to continue on in the chapter from verse 23. By faith, Moses' parents hid him for 3 months after he was born, because they saw he was no ordinary child, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God, rather than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt, because he was looking ahead to his reward. The title of my message this morning is Faith to Choose, Responding in Faith in the Midst of Pressure. And Moses was born into a time when the people of God were under pressure. You can read the original account in the book of Exodus, but just to set the scene for all of us, the children of Israel, God's chosen people, were living in Egypt, where they'd been since the days of Joseph and his brothers, as we heard about last week. But unlike Joseph's day, things were not looking good for the people of God. Many years had passed, and Pharaoh was using them as slaves, putting them to work in backbreaking conditions, working them half to death. And on top of all of this, Pharaoh had instituted a cruel and evil policy. He said that whenever a Hebrew boy was born, that child should be put to death, thrown into the Nile and drowned. And all of that pressure that Pharaoh was putting the people under was designed to weaken their strength and make them submit to him in fear. But the writer of Hebrews reminds us of the faith of Moses' parents in the midst of this time of great pressure. Again, let's read verse 23. By faith, Moses' parents hid him for 3 months after he was born, because they saw he was no ordinary child, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. If Pharaoh was prepared to kill infants, imagine what the punishment would have been for Moses' parents if they were found to be breaking his commandment and hiding their child. Surely all of them would have perished. And as terrible as it is to consider, many Hebrew parents must have given in fear to the king's edict and allowed the unthinkable to happen to their sons. Fear, when we allow it to control us, can allow us to do terrible things. But the writer tells us that Moses' parents were not afraid of the king. They kept Moses safe and hid him because they saw he was no ordinary child. Somehow they knew that this child had a great destiny in God, that this child was called by God for his purposes, that they were saving him to be a part of the great purposes, the great plan of salvation that God had for the world. That despite even the threat of death, all of the pressure that they were under, they refused to respond in fear, but rather chose to respond in faith. And fear of man can be one of the biggest hindrances in our lives to walking in faith to God's plan on our lives. That fear of what others say about us, what others think about us, what others may do to us can be paralyzing when we're wanting to follow God's will. And I know in my own life that fear has been something I've wrestled with in my life. And actually, Jesus speaks into this very issue in Matthew 10:28, when he says, "Do not fear those who kill the body, but cannot kill the soul. Rather, fear him who can destroy both soul and body in hell." As fear of God increases in our hearts, the fear of man decreases. As we acknowledge who God really is, how powerful, how awesome, how sovereign he is, we begin to be less concerned about man's opinion of us and more concerned about God's opinion of us. To fear God doesn't mean that we should be in fear of his judgment of us. Indeed, if we are in Jesus, if we've received that free gift of God, of salvation in Jesus, we can be sure that we are forgiven, we are accepted, we have an eternity guaranteed with him. But to fear God means that we have a holy respect and honor for who he is, for his power, for his holiness, for his authority. And the more we become aware of who he is, the more we trust in his greatness, the less the fear of what others can do to us will have a hold on us in our lives. The more we take our eyes off the influence and power of man and fix our eyes upon who our God is, the more that faith will grow within us. Moses' parents were not afraid of the king's edict. They didn't fear what Pharaoh could do to them, because in faith they knew, however great Pharaoh was, their God was greater. One of our YWAM centers in Malawi works amongst the Yao tribe, and the Yao people are known as a strong and a fierce people. In the days of the slave trade, it was the Yao tribe that used to sell members of other tribes to the Arab slave traders. And our fellow YWAMers who faithfully serve and represent Jesus to this people group have come under immense pressure from the community around them over the years, but they've never given up following God's call and what they've been called to do by God amongst the people. And one of the ministries we're involved in YWAM in that area is to show the Jesus movie in different villages. If you haven't seen it, it's kind of an old, bit slightly old-fashioned, slightly cheesy to our eyes film, but just simply tells the story of Jesus's life and his death and the message of Jesus, of salvation for all people. And it was actually on our first visit to Malawi that Sarah and I were out with the team showing the Jesus movie in different villages. And we went to this one certain village one evening, and we were warned before we got there that the people of this village are known for practicing witchcraft, and they might not be happy that we're going to be there. And in this part of Africa, as soon as the sun sets, it gets dark very quickly. And we arrived just as the sun was setting, And there's no street lights, there's no electricity, there's nothing. Once it gets dark, it's absolutely pitch black. And we were there in the total darkness, setting up for the movie, getting things ready. And I was actually assigned to preach the message after the movie that night. And so I just sat in the back of the vehicle we'd came in and began to prepare my message. And suddenly what came over me, this feeling like a very, very heavy cold. And I started coughing and sneezing, and I could hardly talk, which was very strange because it was so hot. And I felt this sense of fear and anxiety, like a heavy weight, come upon me, which was, it was really unsettling. And I just had this thought come into my mind: how on earth am I going to preach to these people? This is going to be a disaster. They're going to make a mockery of me. I can't even speak right now, let alone preach to a crowd of people. And me and Sarah just started praying in the back of the vehicle, but still this kind of feeling of sickness remained on me and this feeling of anxiety. But we really felt strongly the Lord saying that I should just get up and in faith stand in front of the people and begin to speak. And the time came for me to share. And so I just stood up and I got in front of the people, and suddenly this absolute supernatural peace just came over me. And in an instant, all of the feeling of sickness, whatever it was, passed away, and I was able to speak, and I was able to share the message of the good news of Jesus, that he had died for all people, including the people of this village. And because it was so dark beyond the light of our torches, I couldn't really tell how people were reacting to the message. But at the end of my message, I just invited people to respond by coming forward to receive Jesus. And out of the darkness, first one, then two, then about 30 people came forwards, their heads bowed respectfully, ready to receive Jesus. And that night, many people in that village met with Jesus for the first time. And many of them who responded confessed that they had been using witchcraft, but now they wanted to live for Jesus. Why do I share that story? I hope it doesn't give a wrong impression of me, because the truth is, when I've been faced with that choice between responding in faith or shrinking back in fear, many times I've shrunk back in fear. And to be honest, I really regret those times when I've chosen to respond in fear. I've never regretted the times I've responded in faith. And every time I've chosen to respond in faith and obey God, I've always seen God be faithful to me. I've always seen somehow that he's used me in his purposes. And I really want to encourage you this morning: don't allow the fear of man to rob you of God's call on your life. Don't miss out on the destiny and calling he has for you because of fear of what others think or what others say or what others may do to you. Moses' parents chose to act in faith rather than fear, and so saved Moses for the great work of God that lay ahead in his future, and played their part in God's great plan of salvation in this world. Choose to believe God and respond in faith, and you will be part of advancing the great purposes of God in your lifetime. By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God, rather than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt, because he was looking ahead to his reward. Moses, like his parents, faced pressure from the world around him. While he was still a baby, as the story goes, his mother put him in a basket and placed him by the banks of the River Nile, just in time for Pharaoh's daughter to find him and adopt him as her son. Moses grew up in Pharaoh's own household. He was raised as a prince of Egypt with all of the wealth and the power and the privilege of the king available to him. Egypt was the superpower of the ancient world, and Moses would have experienced the best that the world had to offer. But in Exodus chapter 2, we read of how when Moses was a grown man, one day he went out to see his own people, to see the Hebrew people and what was happening to them. And what he saw was an Egyptian beating a Hebrew man, and he faced a moment of decision. Was he going to turn a blind eye? Was he going to pretend he hadn't seen anything and go back to his life of comfort in Pharaoh's house? Or even was he going to encourage the Egyptian to beat him harder and prove that he was in fact a valid part of Pharaoh's household? Or was he going to choose to identify with God's people, with his own people, and defend the Hebrew man? That moment called for decisive action, and his choice in that moment would affect the trajectory of the rest of his life. What would he do? Moses made his choice. In Exodus 2:12 we read, he looked this way and that, and seeing no one, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. The writer of Hebrews doesn't commend Moses for the act of murdering this Egyptian, but he does commend him for choosing clearly and irreversibly to identify as one of God's people. As the writer sums it up, he chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. Because of his choice to identify with God's people, Moses faced enormous pressure. Where once he could enjoy all the good things of Pharaoh's house as a member of the royal household, now Pharaoh wanted to kill him and drove him into hiding in a foreign land. He had chosen to leave the comfort zone and had stepped out into the costly place of obedience to God. But from now on, Moses knew there was no doubt in his mind that he was one of God's people, that he was one of God's chosen people, and he belonged to God. And those choices he made as a young man were preparing him for the many tests of faith that he would face in his future and in his years to come, when he would lead the people out of Egypt and on to the promised land. And although it goes against everything we would think, God is able to use the pressure that we face from the world around us for good, to refine and strengthen our faith and bring much glory to his name. When we find ourselves under pressure from the world, pressure to conform to its ways, pressure to give in to the fear of what others could do to us or say about us or think about us, we also have an opportunity to respond in faith, to choose God and his ways, and demonstrate clearly and irreversibly that we belong to him. To show those around us that remaining faithful to God is worth more than anything the world could offer us. That what God has to offer us is worth so much more than anything the world has to offer. In 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 6 and 7, Peter gives an encouragement to us as believers. Though now for a little while you may have had to suffer grief in all kinds of trials, these have come so that the proven genuineness of your faith, of greater worth than gold, which perishes even though refined by fire, may result in praise, glory, and honor when Jesus Christ is revealed. If you're finding yourself under pressure from the world around you, don't be discouraged. God is able to use that pressure for good. And he's calling you to rise up and respond, not in fear, but in faith. You have an opportunity to choose to remain faithful to God, to choose to be known as one of his people, to choose to step out and play your part in his purposes in this world. And so to prove to yourself, to the Lord, to the enemy, to the world, that you belong to God and you are totally committed to him. And that opportunity to prove and refine your faith is worth more than gold, or as Moses knew, worth more than all the treasure of Egypt. Because in God we have a great and eternal reward, the wonders of an eternity spent with him. And that will make the things that this world has to offer seem meaningless and empty in comparison. And throughout the history of God's people, it's been in the midst of great pressure, times when the people of God were under the most pressure from the world around them, that revival has broken out. It happened in the early church, in the time that the writer of Hebrews was writing to, as the Christians were facing persecution, revival broke out, and within a short period of time, the whole of the Roman Empire was transformed by Christianity. It's happening today amongst the Yao people in Malawi that I shared about, where every day the number of believers is being multiplied in that people group. And it can happen in our own lives and in our communities as we choose and are willing to rise up in faith. Moses and his parents faced the threat of death. Our fellow Waiwamas who are working amongst the Yao have faced terrible pressure from the community around them, the loss of property, threats to their lives, even the abuse of their children. And in general, as Christians in this nation, we're not under that level of pressure today. And yet there is a pressure that our community, our culture, is constantly putting us under. That pressure to be just like the world around us, that pressure to fear what others think or say about us, that fear and that pressure to conform to the way that things are in this world. And every day we are presented with opportunities, sometimes in just small and simple ways, to choose to respond in faith to that pressure, to choose to stand up and be counted for Jesus, to choose to be obedient to what we know God has called us to do. I wonder what those choices are for you today, or this week, or this year. I wonder what it would look like for you to respond in faith rather than fear today. Let's pray together. Father, I want to thank you for who you are. Jesus, we want to thank you that you are so much greater than the world around us, and what you have to offer is so much greater than what the world has to offer. And Lord, I want to thank you that when we step out in faith, we are able to be a part of your great purposes in this world. And I want to ask for each and every one of us that as we find ourselves presented with those choices today, this week, this year, Lord, help us to be faithful. Help us to choose faith and see what you will do for us. In Jesus' mighty name, amen.